questions to do things that look easy. So I think, we'll have some kind of, I think, helpful lessons tonight. I did send a copy of a PDF of my presentation to Jim. So after the presentation, he could probably send it along to all of you so you have a copy. It's good to have me just do it so you're not on page 6 and then, I'm on page 2. So it's good for us to go through it together. It's still the teacher in me. I can't help it. I can't get out of the classroom, I guess.
Kind of nice to force the page, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. Well, the other thing too, what we're learning is a lot of new superintendents, a lot of new business officials.
Yeah.
And for board members, just for the record, business officials, superintendents are hard to come by, good ones. I mean, we can always find somebody to fill in the seat. I think most of you who know me know my feeling about this, but I'll tell you, business officials are tough.
Yep.
Business officials are tough. I mean, I think we're swapping business officials. There's some coming out of the schools, but they're very inexperienced. And I've had about 3 or 4 districts actually have me do long-range plans with the business officials so they learn their budget, their own budget. And matter of fact, I've had a number of superintendents sitting in on all of our meetings. And we do it by phone call or Zoom, the whole operation. So there's no traveling, nobody, we spend like an hour a week working on it because they're trying to run a business office, or they're trying to run a school district. And with this COVID stuff still going, they're up to their ears. So there's ways to get stuff done. Having sat in those seats in my own career, I'm very sensitive to it. So it sounds like I can't keep a job, doesn't it? It's terrible.
Yeah, one of those 3 years and out deals.
No, well, never.
Hey, what's wrong with this guy?
Yeah, what's wrong with this guy? This guy, he keeps talking about other planets. I don't know what that's about.
Yeah. All right, yeah, and Rick, thank you for the program. We will send that out tomorrow to the group.
Sure.
But thank you so much for your help and your expertise. I think we're ready to go, Mr. Batson. Robert?
Yes. Yes, if we could we'll call the meeting to order here at I've got 6:28 Eastern Standard Time, somewhere around there. If we could all stand for a moment and say the pledge. I see that Madison the Knight of Boces is nice enough to have a flag on
All
site.
right.
Pledge allegiance
To the flag
of the
of the
United States of America and to the
to the
republic
republic for which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible, liberty, and justice for all.
And that's also a good way, Robert, to see who's wearing PJs.
That's right.
Yeah.
No fuzzy slippers, no wide angle lenses here. Keep this professional.
Information I could have used earlier.
Well, that's all right. Thank you for the wide shot there. Everything looks good. We'll turn it over to Mr. Timms to carry on and enlighten us once again.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure and thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen with you, my screen. And if you have questions during it, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat thing and I'll see if I can answer some of those as we go. So if you want to type in some questions in the chat section, go ahead. Or we'll try and save some time at the end to answer questions, whatever you prefer. All right, so we'll pick it up from there. So let me get this full screen going and let me get here we go. Okay, now it's going to take a second. Here what we do is I found the trick to lining all this stuff up. So here we go.
All right.
It's not quite there. Hang on, watch this. I think we can even make it bigger. How's that?
Nice.
Okay. Huh?
Nice.
Kid's hot. Kid's hot. Okay, here we go. All right, so state aid and federal aid considerations for 21 and 22 and beyond. Like I said, I'm a long-range financial analysis guy, and I like data. I like to find out what we're doing and what the possibilities are. So some of this we can kind of scoot through, but some of it I think we're going to want to take our time. So first of all, this was the goal that Jim gave me with federal funds allotted for in the CARES Act and so on, the Coronavirus Response Consolidated Act, which is CRISA, and the American Rescue Act. There are several ways schools can use these resources, and I'm going to talk about some different scenarios. I also want to talk about multi-year fiscal planning with these things. But I'm also concerned that I don't want to go back to December 2020 when we had fiscal cliffs, because when these grants are done, by 24, 25, these grants are going to be done. All the grants are going to be done. And the federal support for the state is also going to be done. So I think we're going to be looking at another cliff. And last but not least, I think we've got to have pace. There's got to be some pacing here. We can't spend this all at once. We've got to kind of watch our step. So what I did is I provided for you, I didn't know Madison and Herkimer were in here. I will actually, after this presentation, I will add your districts to this chart. But there is a chart out there that was actually provided by the Council of School Superintendents. You see, I'm giving credit to it, to all the schools. Niskus did it, Bob Lowry did a great job, but it shows basically how much each district is entitled to based on all the money that's coming in both the CRISA and the ARPA accounting. So they're two different plans, really. And there's two different life cycles to these plans, and there's two different requirements to the plans, although I must tell you, they're extremely similar. So in the CRISA, the Coronavirus Act, basically the period of eligibility for the funds is from February of 20 to September of 22. But there's something known as the Tidings Amendment. And the Tidings Amendment is a sometimes used law that allows you to extend the period of use for one more year, kind of carry over the funds. So you've got to think of it as going to the year 23, September of 23. Now you got to keep in mind that this thing was passed in a March and it's extended to a September, neither which of these dates really coincides with school district fiscal years. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, there's really two major sources of funds. There's the, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief called the GEAR, and then there's Elementary, Secondary, and Emergency Relief Fund called ESSER. Now, just to back up, you can see that here's what we've got is GEAR money here, here's ESSA money here, and I'll send out this entire spreadsheet for you so you can all find your districts in here. And you can see here's ESSER 3. So things are pretty much laid out for you. They just use these, I don't even know why they actually did this. What they wanted to do is show that the feds gave you some money and there was discretionary money on the part of the governor's office for the GEAR. Now, the allowable expenses are very similar to the CARES Act, and I'm going to go over them coming up. But the funds do not have a supplement versus a plant requirement. Most federal funds that you apply for using an FS10 form are usually supplement requirement. In other words, you're not supposed to be using them for anything you're already paying out of your general fund. This grant does not have that obligation. So you can supplant. In other words, what you can do is you can pay using this grant things that are already in your general fund, which I think would be a big boost to districts. And I'm going to talk more about that later. Now, the funds are awarded to the public school district, but they have to apply. Non-publics are sometimes in these federal grants, but not in these. So the good thing is they're sacrosanct to the school district. Now, the emergency, the GEAR funds, this is where I did an excerpt, and you can probably read through all the verbiage, but I highlighted a couple spots in red that might be of particular interest to you. Number 3, to support the ability of local educational agencies to continue to provide educational services to their students and to support ongoing functionality. If you notice, that's unbelievably broad. So you can practically use it for anything you want, but I must tell you that you still have to have the grant approved and you must send it into SED for approval. So I think what you have to do is outline in your FS10, which is the form that you fill out, exactly how you're going to use this. And they're going to want to know about, staffing and costs and what you're going to buy or what you're going to do with the money. But this is a pretty broad approach, number 3. But down at the bottom, I think there was a comment mentioned earlier about broadband, but look at this. To provide access for reliable high-speed internet for students and teachers through the purchase of internet-connected devices and equipment, mobile hotspots, wireless service plans, or the installation of community hotspots, especially in underserved communities. So for some of the communities, this could be a real plus. Also, so purchasing hardware and software applications for teachers and providing access to digital learning equipment, apps, tools, and so on that make relevant learning to all students, and covering associated materials, particularly with students with disability or English language learners. And last but not least, and I think this is a good one for many districts, and that would be to provide professional development and training for teachers on effective strategies, just in case you have to go to remote or digital again. But I got to believe some of that would transfer into the classroom. So all those would be great uses. Now, the key I would suggest that you use in terms of how to divide up this money, and that is you want to try and use the money for things that do not have reoccurring escalating costs if you're going to use the money to supplement your budget. In other words, what you don't want to do is if you're going to use it for professional development, like if down here in this last bullet, you want that professional development to maybe inculcate a culture or a system or some type of functionality into your district within the 3-year period you have this money available, knowing that at the end of that time, the culture is going to have to take over for itself. The other thing too is purchasing hardware and software is great, but remember, hardware and software, particularly in technology, only lasts 3 to 5 years. So what you better have, I think, is maybe a plan to update this hardware and software when this grant is over. So it could put pressure on your budget. So those are things you've got to keep in mind. Okay, now let's see if we can move on to the next slide here. If I can get the next slide. Now, the ESSER funds, this is another excerpt. I've highlighted a couple. Providing principals and other school leaders with resources necessary to address the needs of individual schools. That is so broad. So I think you can do a lot of things with this. Now, sometimes what it is it could be hiring, let's say, a social worker, resource worker, but those types of people, if you're supplementing your budget, they would have reoccurring escalating costs. So if you're going to do that, you would do it in the grant, okay? But you have to know that when the grant is over, you're going to have to either take the burden on for these people, or you're going to have to unemploy these people. So it becomes a situation you have to be careful of. But last, look at this last one. Other activities that are necessary to maintain the operate is similar to the one we just saw earlier. So this is kind of like you basically can do almost anything. Now, I must tell you that a district I know is trying to buy a dehumidifier. They have a pool in their school. They're trying to buy a dehumidifying system, and it was actually rejected. So I think what's going to happen here is as we start applying and the word gets around of what's a go and what's a no-go, we'll have a better idea on what we can actually use some of this for. But again, you can see number 9 is that hardware and software. You can see activities for learning. Here's summer learning and after school programs. The only thing I would caution you about for summer learning and supplemental after school programs is here might be your big chance to do something different. Many schools have summer learning programs of some sort or a supplemental after school program of some sort. But my question would be, how well are these working? And here, is this your big chance to get some professional development for teachers or teacher assistants or wherever you're going to use for this so that you can actually get a better bang for the buck? In other words, I find most summer school programs and after school programs sometimes work very well, but sometimes not so hot. So this could be a good chance to do a little research and dig into these. Now the ARPA, the actual, the American Relief Plan Program here, Act, this again goes to 23 and it's extended to 24. So you can see it, we go another year out. So the other one went to 22, but we can extend it to 23. This one goes to 23. We can extend this money to 24. Again, it's going to require an FS10F for a final report. FS10 is simply the buzzword for the type of form you use. So business officials, this would make more sense to you than anyone. The source of funds, of course, we got this ESSER money, right? This elementary and secondary relief. And there's 2 allocations, 90% directly to districts based on the 2020 Title I counts. But 10% went to school districts distributed by formula that the state budget decided. So there was some finagling to get this money to different school districts. So some districts got a lot more than others based on some type of needs category the state came up with and Title I. Now, 20% of the 90% ESSER grant must be spent on learning loss remediation. Now, what this means is anybody's guess. So I think here's a chance for working with students. You know, if you have an AIS program, maybe you could bolster that up. You could do, again, this could be summer school or after school activities, but it's supposed to address learning loss. Now, a lot of people do not like the term learning loss because it's not like they lost the learning. The remote learning was so difficult, they just didn't acquire as much learning, I believe, as we want. I'm sure there was some loss, but the truth of it is, I think what happens is we just couldn't get enough through in those classrooms and remote than we would if we were had in-person instruction. So it's got a really nice balance in terms of like the CARE Act. You can use it to support your budget. And this way here, again, you can supplant or supplement. There's also, there was actually some amounts for districts whereby certain portions of the grants had to be used for summer enrichment programs. But here's what was interesting. They didn't just say summer school, they said summer enrichments, but it has to be evidence-based. So I think you may have to justify some of that in your application. And again, the after school has to be on an evidence-based comprehensive after school program. In other words, not just simply do what you always do. And of course, the remaining funds can be for learning loss, supporting implementation of interventions, summer learning or anything. And so it's got a whole list of things, but it does make sure it includes low-income students, children with disabilities and English learners, migrant students, students experiencing homelessness, and children in foster care. This could be your district's big chance if you have kids that fall into these categories: emotional needs, academic and social needs. This could be a big chance for your district to make up a lot of ground to really make sure these kids, there are social, emotional learning issues, all types of things, homelessness, and we do have these in all of our counties, foster care and so on. So this could be a big plus for you, but remember, the money runs out. Now, there is a maintenance of equity. What they don't want you doing is cutting per pupil spending somewhere else and putting it in the grant. So this is actually not a bad thing, especially in high poverty schools and rural schools in particular. What I would suggest you do is if you decide to supplant, in other words, take people or items that are in your current budget and pay for them out of the federal budget, you should maintain those costs in your own budget, whether you use the money or not. If you actually decrease those costs out of your budget and put them in the federal money, when the federal money's gone and you inherit those costs, you will have financial difficulties and you will not be able to maintain the equity that's required. Now, general reporting requirements. They're different grants. So you are called the LEA, right? You are the school district as the LEA, the it's the learning agency, educational agency. And you have to have expenditure-based reporting. So this money is not in your general fund budget. This money is not allowed to go there. It has to be in what's called the special fund. And what happens is you have different funds in your school district. You have a school lunch fund, you have a capital fund, you may have a debt service fund, you have a general fund, and you have a special act fund. And that's where this money has to be. And that's where it has to be accounted for. So you have to start accounting for the spending of this money. You have to show what the money was spent on, and I would use a uniform system of account codes like you're using right now in the general funds, similar. You have to show FTE positions, full-time equivalent positions that you're using. So they're going to want to audit this at the end of use of this money. And this is where you don't want to get entangled in controversy that the money was inappropriately used or inappropriately spent. Make sure your grant is fully applied for and approved. Okay. And it also, student participation engagement in any remote learning has to be documented, and the proportion of students that are provided devices for internet access has to be documented. So there's a lot of record keeping with this. Now, need I say that while this is a nice thing to happen to a district to get all this money, there's going to be people in central office, particularly in the business office, going to be working their tail off trying to get all this documented. So please, easy on the business official. This is going to be a lot of work. Now, the ARP plan also requires that you have a safe way to return to in-person instruction, and you had to put in a plan within 30 days. Actually, you had to do it before school year started to make publicly available a website plan for the safe return to in-person instruction. And our comments just before I started our program about kids being out and we're having all kinds of issues, in-person instruction is what you're supposed to be focusing in on as much as possible, and the continuity of services. And the plan must be publicly available, and you must seek public comment. Now, I'm sure all of you have done that. The ARPA, first issuance of the ARPA plan is due in paper. The paper version is due to SED, I think it's September 30th. Also, you have to post on a website a plan by school year. Now, you're going to apply for this grant all at once. They want you applying for it all at once because the feds put a stipulation on the state saying, look, at the end of the first year, we're going to want to know how much money you want. And that's how much money we're sending you, period. So the state has said, please give us a full-blown plan to use all the money. You can amend it later. We can review it later, but please send us a full plan. And I've highlighted some things. How much will be spent? Where? Identify programs, utilize such funding, and continue upon the availability. In other words, what programs you're going to continue. That's why you can supplant some out of your budget, but keep the program also in your budget. You have to identify local funds that could also be used. Okay, so you want to be able to get these things back in your budget if you do some supplementing or supplanting, and of course seek public comment. So it's supposed to be able to, so that anybody could say, well, I think we ought to do this, we ought to do that, and so on. So you seek public comment. Other considerations. You're supposed to maximize use of the funds. The federal government and the state actually want you to use all the money. This isn't a case of, well, use what you can and just return the rest or don't even ask for it. They want it all used. So caution has got to be used. You got to make sure that you're watching your pricing, the cost that you're telling SCD about. And if you have to update this grant by what they call an FS25, when you amend your forms, then you could do that. So you have to keep this. Now, some of you may be getting FEMA grants, which is a separate funding source for instance, for all the PPE you had to buy. But right now, most of the districts, at least I'm working with as my clients, we've actually already applied for the CRISA money, and they've reimbursed their general fund for the PPE, so they've been made whole. So it depends on which route you're taking. And of course, there are what they call Section 611 and 619 funds. These are kids who, by court order, are placed in special schools because of their disabilities. Okay. So the funds will be available there for another year. So you really should be focusing on, I know everybody wants to work and all the kids are always showing up and quote our kids, but really the homeless kids and homelessness, this is a good chance to attack that if it's a problem in your school, but also internet access that we were talking about earlier before I started the program. But I put down et cetera, because there's just so much you can do. I think this really deserves a robust discussion at a board table and with administrators and so on, because this would be our big chance to do two things I see. One is help the students in our charge that we are responsible for to do better, to have better performance and so on. And second, help school district build fund balance for future years, because inflation is creeping up on us. We have our tax cap situation here. And I think probably by 23, 24, the state's going to have a financial cliff perhaps for state aid. I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. So this is not to be, your plan should have a full grant period, which is the full 3 years. At FS10A will be allowed, so you could actually apply for amendments. Need a plan now, how these spent. You've got to get work on this right away. Like I said, the first set of the ARPA plan is supposed to go in, I think, by the end of the month. Now, there are different periods of availability for each of the grants. So it's going to be a bookkeeping nightmare trying to keep up with this. But it's going to be just like any other part of your budget and all the different funds. It's just going to be, you're adding a whole series of funds on here for the business official to keep track of. And something tells me principals and superintendents will be involved in this as well. And they'll be monitored by school board members. So they're one-time grants. What happens when they end is the thing I'm worried about as a long-range planner. So if you're getting a $500,000 or $2 million, the big thing is if you buy a whole bunch of things that have escalating costs, when that money's gone, how do you absorb those costs? I think you'll be very hard pressed to be able to do any of that. Now, the American Rescue Plan also, here's the availability. This is all the legal knowledge or legal uses of funds, and it's got the actual citations here. But the ones I find more important, I put this in so you can see the whole piece of law, is ones down here. Look at this K, purchasing educational technology. See how they're all so similar? They're very, very similar. One was for COVID because they panicked during COVID, and the feds put out this huge amount of money to schools to help get COVID. Then everybody said, well, wait a minute, that helped them get through COVID. We need more money to survive after COVID, because a lot of them have lost a lot of money. The kids are far behind and things like this. So you can see there's such similarity between these two grants. It's just simply amazing. So money will be pouring into the school district, but you've got to use it wisely. Here's some ones I put down. Here's that mental health, the social and emotional needs I talked about. But notice evidence-based full service community schools. So they want wraparound services for these kids. Okay, look at summer, here's again, summer and after school programs, a new grant. Here we again, low income kids, children with disabilities, English language, racial and ethnic minorities, homelessness, foster care, things like this. So here's our chance to take the kids who struggle the most and help them the most. Remember, we're working in school systems. Board members are members of boards of education. The feds are saying, come on, we're plowing all this money into schools, make it count for these kids. Again, look at this, high quality assessments that are valid and reliable to assess students' academic progress and assist educator in meeting academic needs through differentiated instruction. I think this is a shot across our bow. I would not doubt that at some point the feds or the state will be asking us how we're measuring our progress. So it would be wise for school districts, superintendents, principals, and so on, teachers, department chairs, and so on, to start taking a look at quality assessments to see if we're actually addressing this need in L with the appropriate assessments, because I think they're going to need some validation. And then evidence-based activities to meet comprehensive needs of kids. So now we know that school's not school. They miss their friends, but there's social emotional issues. Some of these kids are carrying on their back. They're far behind. Some of the kids who usually do well in school are worried that they won't get into colleges. There's all kinds of things going on. Providing information assistance to parents and families and how they can support students. So to me, this is a good chance for outreach to parents and families. So it's nice to have an open house when all the kids who are doing well and all their parents show up and they come to open house. But I think what we got to do here is we've got to do some outreach to some parents and families for kids that are struggling and see if we can help them, especially if it includes a distance learning environment. Like we said, some of these kids are going to be out for a long time, but a couple of days here, a couple of days there. But if any of our schools get hit, really hard with this COVID, we may need to go back to some type of distance learning, at least in the short term, who knows? And then we've got to tackle student attendance and student engagement. The problem was a lot of kids just didn't sign on. I know I have a daughter who's a teacher, and some days she would have to be calling homes because the kids were still in bed and never signed on, and parents were at work or something. So we really got to improve that attendance, and we've got to get the kids to the buildings. Here's the one that's really interesting. School facility repairs and improvements and operation of schools at risk of transmission. So we see a lot of school districts are calling me saying, I want to put in HVAC. I want to put in air conditioning. I want to put in air handling units. If we're going to do summer school, I've got to have some air conditioning in there. Well, even though I think that they're leaning toward helping you with this, I've got some issues with it. I think the big problem is going to be how you get the money. Normally, when you do a capital project, you go bond for the money. You have permission to borrow during the capital project because you got to pay all these bills. I think this money is going to come in drips and drabs. It's going to be hard to get a hold of it for capital project work. And I don't think SED is really geared up for like 600-700 school districts handing in capital projects. So to me, I think the better way to handle the facility repairs and improvement operation would be in a traditional way, but using the federal money to get you there. My suggestion would be supplement your budget as much as possible so you end up with more fund balance. Take that fund balance and put it into something known as a capital reserve for capital construction, or capital reserve for technology, or a capital reserve for vehicles, or a capital reserve for equipment, things like this, so that you can actually build a source of funds that would be large enough to actually offset the cost of a capital project that was beyond your building aid ratio. So I think there's another way to address that. Inspection, testing, maintenance, and replacement upgrade projects, indoor air quality, again, filtering, purification, air conditioning, ventilation. I just think this is going to be too cumbersome to do it under the federal statutes right now. I don't think SED is prepared to do it. They issued a statement early in September saying, yeah, you fill out the same forms and everything, but they didn't say anything about how you get your money. And if you can't get your money, even though you fill out the forms and you do all the bidding and you get people in to do the work, it would be a big cash flow issue, I'm afraid. So I think there's maybe another way to handle this if you don't need it like immediately. And then it says, look at this one. Other activities that are necessary, just like we saw in the last type of grant. It's like anything you really need to employ existing staff. So I think what's going to happen here is that This is a good one for staff development. This is a good one for continuity services, social workers, SROs, school psychologist services, more teacher assistants temporarily, maybe even for a couple of years with a specific group of children that need help. So you could make it like a program that would last a couple of years or something like that. Or you could pay current people out of the federal monies and then build fund balance so that you could do these things in the future. So there's quite a bit here. It's just like pages and pages of this. But here's some things I would suggest in the do and don't do if we're going to summarize this. So if supplement example, don't hire additional staff or purchase programs that will need to exist with money from the school's general fund after the end of the grant. Because what's going to happen is you're going to bear the cost, but not such things as teacher aides, assistants, special duty personnel who are needed by the district in a time period that will extend past the end of the grant. You got to try and avoid that because you will inherit that cost. Any new or enhanced program, reading, math, remediation, teacher supports, professional mentoring, professional development, that would go past the end of the grant are going to be problematic. So to me, I wouldn't do that. But what I would do is this. I would purchase additional staff or purchase programs that will not exist past the general fund. In other words, for instance, maybe some classes could use an extra teacher assistant in them if you can find them, to support the teacher because of the needs of those sets of students. And everybody should be aware that this is going to be a 2 or 3 year gig, and that's it. Or what you can do is if you can actually figure out who's going to be retiring and who's staying and who's not, and who's this and that, sometimes you can actually scoop these people up to replace existing staff even when the grant's over. Now, here to me would be a great chance to do some research if you do not have a relatively new reading or math or remediation program, or you need some type of professional development for your staff. This would be a great time to get it, all right, and supplement your budget right now. So that technically professional staff development for your staff could last well. In other words, it will live on beyond the length of the grant, but the cost will not. So will a new reading program, new math programs, remedial programs, and so on. So all those could be very helpful. Now, if I were you though, I would also strongly look at a supplant example. I would fund current staff or initiatives with grant funds, but keep the costs that were associated with these items in the general fund during all or most of the grant period. But what you got to do is you got to make sure that you escalate the fund. So what I mean is when the grant ends, reallocate the expense to the staff initiatives back to the general fund. So let's just say I had $4 million in teacher salaries, and I take, let's make it up, 500,000, I put it under the federal grant. Do I lower my budget by 500,000? No, I keep it at $1 million, and I keep it in my budget the whole time. So when those $500,000 worth of teachers come back into my budget, I've got a budget line big enough to accept them. But you've got to make sure, and this is this next bullet, make sure that annually the cost reallocated to the grants escalates within the general fund. Remember, if you take a teacher and start paying them out of federal funds in the current year, and 4 years later, you bring them back into your general fund, they won't be making the same amount of money. They will have gotten raises. So you must escalate your general fund to make sure that you can accept these people without any negative consequences back into your general fund once the federal monies are gone. Now, this will give you excess fund balance, which of course the controller hates. But I gotta believe that most of you need to really bolster up your reserves. Workers' comp reserve, ERS reserve, the new TRS sub-fund reserve, the unemployment reserve, especially if you're not going to be able to accept these people in, you'll definitely need that one. Some of you may actually have a tax certiorari reserve that needs funding. You may have an EBLR reserve that needs funding, but I got to believe most of you could make good use of capital reserves. But remember, capital reserves need voter approval to start. So this may, if I was still a superintendent, I'd be looking at ways that if I did not have sufficient number of capital reserves for equipment, vehicles, maybe buses, and capital projects, I would ask the voters to start them and I would fund them with this excess fund balance over the next 3 years. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath here. I see somebody's chatting. Hello there. Here's a question that I received from a superintendent. If the funds are allocated and maintained in separately coded accounts, I assume they do not count toward the fund balance limit, correct? Unallocated fund balance. Okay, well, the special aid fund does not count toward your unallocated fund balance or that 4% limit that everybody's talking about that you're allowed to have under real property tax law 1318. But any excess fund balances you get by supplanting that's why you will transfer that money to your proper reserves and build reserves accordingly. I hope that answers the question. So it won't count if it's in the grant, over on the grant side, the special aid fund, but it will count if this money is left in the general fund. So what I do is I take any fund balances past the 4% and I would put them into a reserve. And there's a ton of reserves to go through. I know my clients, I work with them all the time to update their reserves. There's lots of reserves to choose from. So I would definitely be putting them into reserves for use at a future date, particularly capital reserves, because they're a gift that keeps on giving. I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you use a capital reserve for a building project, you actually get aid on your own money. So let's make it up. Let's say you did a $10 million capital project and you used $2 million of your capital reserve in this project. You then would actually only borrow $8 million and pay interest on $8 million. But if you spent the whole $10 million on your capital project, you would actually get your building aid ratio and you would get aid on the entire $10 million project plus interest for the 15 years it is amortized. So you would actually get some of your money back plus interest. So it would be very, very advantageous. Okay, let's see if I can get this thing to go here. My screen seems to be frozen here. Let's see what's going on. All right. Whoop, got a little crazy there. Okay, now, capital projects and use of the grant funds. There was a Q&A issued by the Office of Facilities Planning, the OFP at SED on the 1st of September. It says permits it the same way as always. It also notes that a board resolution will be needed and no public vote is needed for a capital project using federal funds. Now that's important, a board resolution. Now I've talked to a couple of attorneys for my clients and they're going, holy cow. So now we got to figure out a way to write a resolution for a board that uses the federal funds. So this is going to be new land here for the attorneys. Now, if you're going to use both federal and a regular general fund monies or capital fund monies, then you would actually need voter approval for the portion that was going to be using capital fund monies and not federal money. You also still have to go through the seeker process, and the environmental agency always wants the seeker process done through any capital project. But there's some unresolved issues that I find problematic. With the support of their school attorneys, it must be determined the required contents of the board resolution. So what you probably are going to have to do is talk to your school attorney, not your bond counsel, probably your school attorney, because bond counsel is going to have anything to do with this because you're not borrowing money. And you'll have to probably have within the resolution how much money you're going to use in federal money and what it will be used for. So you'll have to identify some type of scope and then what period of time it would be used. So the resolution will be new turf to go over with your attorney. But the problem I have is exactly how does a district apply through the grant to get the money? In other words, what is the criteria for the approval? So you're going to send something off the plans and specifications off the Office of Facilities Planning, but you have to have prior approval for the actual grant application before you can even do the board resolution. That is unresolved. Then how do you secure funds? FS25 is the normal form from the grant, but would you get money for the pre-planning phase when they submit plans and specifications, after you bid, during the construction? What about the final cost reports? And then what reporting requirements? I find all these tremendously problematic because if you start a capital project and you don't get the money to pay the capital project along the way, you're going to have a big problem. So to me, I kind of would avoid this at this point in time. I know there's some architects and construction managers really pushing. We should do this with the federal money. Let's get air conditioning in here. Let's get air units. Let's get new doors and windows in here. Well, that's fine, except I can't figure out, even as a financial advisor for my clients, how you're going to get your money, and SED has not issued any guidance on that. So I find that very problematic. To me, I'm not jumping until we know how we get our money. Now, I'm going to transition over to the other thing that's related to this, and this is state aid. And what I'm going to do is show you 2 slides of 2 different types of school districts and state aid. Now, I don't mean types like urban versus rural. I'm talking about foundation aid types, because some school districts actually have been underfunded in foundation aid for years. And now the state just passed a law saying that in the next 3 years, they're going to fully fund all the districts that were underfunded. So here's an example of a district that was underfunded in foundation aid. So if you notice, look at their foundation aid, went up 5.18%, $604,888. So this is a good chunk of change. And also new this year, a huge increase in universal pre-K, because the state wants more full-time pre-K. So this is the carrot and the stick routine. So what they're going to do is they're trying to offer more money to the school. Now, what they don't tell you is this money, foundation aid goes into your general fund, but kindergarten goes in again to the special aid fund. So it's separate from your general fund. The problem is that any full-day kindergarten or universal pre-K program in the state basically is run, the amount of aid that they give you, regardless of how much it is supposed to be seed money every year for the pre-K program, not fully pay for it. So I've got to believe that any district that all of a sudden grabs onto this is going to have some increasing, escalating, reoccurring costs. Not that it's a bad idea. Universal pre-K is obviously needed in many communities, but the key thing is this money will not be enough for any district to actually fund the entire program. You'll be putting in some of your own money. So you notice the big increase. This is the carrot. They're trying to get more pre-K. Now, I advise all business officials and superintendents and boards to never, ever, ever budget the amount of money they tell you they're going to give you in your state aid. Never, ever. And that's because many of the numbers from here down are wrong. And they're wrong because they're estimates. For instance, the BOCES number that they give you is based on data that was submitted last November. Right. So it hasn't been updated when they do the state aid run. Probably been updated now, but it's been updated after you approved your budget. So you should always underestimate your state aid in your budget. High cost aid and private access aid for students with disabilities and severe needs. These kids obviously need the most help of any kids in a school district, and those programs are extremely expensive. So every now and then I'll have a new person tell me, new superintendent, business official, or board member say, oh, look at all the money we're getting in private excess cost aid. Is that good? Well, it's good because you're educating kids who need it. But remember, the money you get in these programs are only partial reimbursements for the full cost of the program. This money does not pay for any full program of any school district. They also started combining some, like hardware and technology. They combine software, library, and textbook now. So you'll see that there's hardly any money. You notice that these are negative numbers. The thing you've got to worry about, if your school district is losing enrollment, these numbers tend to get stagnant or go down because these are based on an enrollment number. They pay per student. Then we've got transportation. Well, transportation, again, is an estimate based on estimates that were placed in SED in November for the April budget. So again, it's an estimate. So it looks like a big increase here, but it could be they bought a couple of buses or 3 or 4 buses. So who knows? And then building aid, they usually get fairly right, pretty close, but a lot of times they don't have your new capital project in there, especially if you just finished one up. So you got to be careful with these numbers. But what really is starting to bother me is if we look at your total state aid, they're telling you it's $22,033,000 in this case. When you take out that UPK, which some districts have, some don't, and it's in the special aid fund, in terms of helping your regular budget, you're not going to get 22 million. They're guessing closer to 21.55. That's a big difference. That's almost $500,000 difference. Now, the pandemic adjustment we had last year is no longer here. So they're going to get around 22.5. I would definitely, if I was budgeting this as a business official or superintendent, and I think the board should want that this amount of money should not be budgeted, some amount less than this money should be budgeted. Because if you come in short and these numbers are too high, you're going to have a problem with revenue for your budget. Now, the other thing they published when they did the state aid run is they publish your CRISA and ARPA allocations. And in this case, look at the millions of dollars this district will get. So it looks like Christmas in July almost, but remember, this is supposed to last 3 to 4 years. And this number, by the way, has changed since they've done the run. They've actually updated it. But you can see that this district's got a lot of planning to do. But the most important part of this whole thing is down here. This district was underfunded in foundation aid. They were short 2.3 million. So the state gave them 6.4888. But in the law they passed, they promised to pay off the balance, 1.699, over the next 2 years. So instead of paying this 604 over 3.8 years, which would be 4 years, they've got to pay 50% of this number. So this district will get 849,000 for the next 2 years after this year. But the question I have is, okay, once you're made whole, how much money will you get? By then, all the federal money supporting the state will be gone. And I'm worried that the state will not have enough money to fund some of these districts as robustly as it's shown here. So I think we could be facing a fiscal cliff in revenue for us, I'd say 3 to 4 years out. Now let's take a look at these numbers here I told you we're concerned about. Now here's a district that is not Save Harmless, and you notice, look at this. In other words, they have been getting their foundation aid, the amount that they've been told. Matter of fact, in this case, they were actually getting $3,596 more than the formula would give them. There's parts of this formula have to be updated. And I hope maybe we will have a chance, maybe in January or something, that we could maybe have a little legislative session. I could help you there, even if I work with just, the superintendent's cabinet, I think that works on legislation, because there are things that could help you with this formula, because you're not going to be able to survive, I think, in foundation aid moving at 2 or 3%. The minimums this year were 2 to 3%. In other words, they took a whole category of school districts that weren't entitled to any more money. They said, and they made up a new set of formulas that either gave them 2 to 3%. This district just happened to get 3. But you'll notice overall, it's got a good chunk of change here, but their big increase is $230,000. This is not going to last forever, and I think there'll be a cliff. The problem is now, this year, because of this new funding, they're overfunded by $124,000. There's no incentive for the state to take school districts that are losing enrollment and keep paying them more money. It's becoming an issue in the legislature. However, I must also say that every legislator wants to bring home the bacon. So they all want increases for school districts. I just don't think they're going to be robust going into the future. And again, these types of aids are problematic. So I think these Save Harmless districts, they call them Save Harmless because the foundation aid formula says that they really don't deserve any more money. They obviously need it. They've got reoccurring escalating costs like everybody else. Now, here's how I look at the entire picture with the state aid funding now, because if we've got all this federal funding coming in, and a lot of the state's finances right now are being funded by the feds, that's what I'm worried about. Foundation aid right now is $19.8 billion. They just spent 2.5 paying the underfunded, and if they pay 50% each of the next 2 years, then they'll have them all paid up. So then they really won't owe them anything. But then there's the Save Harmless district, so they paid $355 million to them. And if they give them a 2.5% increase each of the next 2 years, they'll actually end up paying much more money. But the dilemma comes when all of a sudden you start adding all this out, because what happens is there's a cumulative total going on here. So what's going to happen is this number over here, this 19.8 million, by the time we get to the end of the 25-26 year, will be almost $4.5 billion larger. So think of the math for a second. Getting a 5% or a 2% raise of $19 million gets you one number. But if you increase this number to, we'll say, let's make it up, $25 billion, a 2 or 5% will cost much more. So the dilemma is that I think it's going to be less sustainable over time. If we look at the total aid picture, we got something similar. If we added up all the foundation aid and the non-foundation aid, which would be like your building aid, your BOCES aid, public access cost aid, textbook aid, all that kind of aid, they're spending 29 billion. But using the same scenario of, we'll say, even a 2.5% increase in that money over each of the next 4 years, that will increase really to about $34.5 billion. So it's going to cost a good chunk of change to keep, we'll say, 2 or 3% going to every single school district in the state. It'll be a lot harder to send 2 to 3% of $34 billion than it would have been to send 2 or 3% of 29 billion. So I'm a little concerned about where we're going in the future, because we're going to end up with all this money coming in over the next 3 or 4 years, federal money, state money, and then somebody's going to pull the rug out from underneath us. Now, again, I'll send out a chart to Jim with having all of Madison County, Herkimer County, and Oneida County in it. But here's Oneida County right now. And what you'll see on this thing, matter of fact, Jim, what I'll do is tonight, I'll actually update that PDF for you, and I'll have this into PDF so that when you send it out tomorrow, it'll have everybody's data in it, okay?
Thank you, Rick. Thanks.
All right, yeah, it just takes up so much space, but yeah, I had it all in there. It's just too small to read.
Yeah, thank
So,
you.
So what I'll do is I'll have everybody's in, but notice the red numbers. The red numbers are the districts that were saved harmless, and the black numbers are the districts where the foundation aid is hypothetically, the red numbers are the ones that are underfunded, and the black numbers are the save harmless districts. Now, some people might call this in economics that they were overfunded. We prefer to use the term save harmless, but you can see the rate of increase here. Some of these were pretty big, look at, and they're in red. That's because they're trying now to make up for the money they haven't been sending them. But if you notice, a lot of the numbers in black, 2.9, 2.9, 2.9, 2.9, 2.9, that's not even anywhere near sometimes what you're going to need. But here's the part that scares me the most. So we've got the foundation aid per student based on a ton of wealth measures. Remember, the foundation aid formula and a brochure that the state education department puts out on it is 40 pages long. So you all get differing amounts based on a number of factors, huge number of factors. And some of you are save harmless and some of you are not. And some of you had a big increase, some not. But here's the part that worries me over here on the end. Let me give an example. So let's get like a New York Mills. So I'm using New York Mills because they are underfunded, so they're making up for their funds. Well, here you go. So what happens is they gave them a good increase. So their increase is 244,000. Then if they're going to make up this difference of 686 each year, they're going to have to pay them 343 each year. But then if they only have to pay them 2.5% after that, their aid will drop to 102. A real bizarre example would be the city of Utica. 15 million next year, 15 million a year after that. But if they only get 2.5%, it'd be 4 million. And if you'll notice, some of you are going up and some of you are going down, but we don't know what the increases will be. So there's a big dilemma here in terms of how the state will handle this by the 24-25 school year. I'm concerned. And that gets us to the last topic we're going to discuss tonight. And that is the tax cap. I'm going to give you an example of how this thing works, because here's what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is with all this flush federal money in, actually, I think residents of school districts would say, geez, you got all this money. How about some tax relief, for God's sakes? Well, the big problem is like I said before, if you are not supplanting and you're supplementing, then you're going to have to re-inherit these costs. You're going to need all the tax money you can get in 3 to 4 years from now. But if you make mistakes along the way, you are not going to be able to get it. So let me show you a couple examples. So this is an example of a tax cap calculation. So what we start off with is the tax levy from the previous year. So if this is a calculation for the current year, we start off with the number which was the tax levy for the last year. So I picked 10 million bucks. Then the Office of Real Property Tax Services actually sends you a tax-based growth factor number. And the number is 1 point something. Each district is different, and it's based on the tax-based growth. Now, this has nothing to do with equalization rates, okay? This has nothing to do with your assessments. This is the growth of the tax base. In other words, what's in the tax base now that wasn't in there last year that can be taxed? New buildings, new houses, new parking lots, new something that can be taxed now that couldn't be taxed before. So this is an indication of how much your district's tax base is growing. If you don't have a number, in other words, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers. If you don't have a number in the third spot, you're not growing very much. Okay. So in this case, and this is for most of our districts in our region, our entire region. So what happens here is this district's not growing much. But if you notice, there's an X here, which means you multiply the factor times the levy. In other words, what the state is telling you is you got increased tax base, go get it, because now you can increase your levy by the increase in the tax base. Then what you do is you add the pilots from last year in, because you collected the pilots separately, payments in lieu of taxes, you collected it separately from your tax levy. So this would then give you the total amount of money you collected in, hypothetically, pilots and taxes. But then you subtract from it your capital levy. Now your capital levy includes a whole bunch of stuff. It includes, for instance, your capital debt service schedule minus building aid. In other words, your interest plus principal for your capital projects that you still have going on and you owe money on, minus building aid. Whatever's left is called the local share. That would be how much money you would have in your exclusion. But there's more. There's actually BOCES capital projects, like a regular capital project, like a school district would have. But there's also O&M capital expenses, operations and maintenance capital expenses. But also bus purchases are part of capital levies. So all this is in there. Now this is a negative number because it's being subtracted. That's the subtraction sign. So this was last year's capital levy exclusion subtracted from the amount. And therefore what happens is you were supposed to have collected that. So now you're down to 9.7 million. Then you multiply that number by an allowable growth factor. This is the consumer price index. And this is where the 2% tax cap gets its name. This number, last year's inflation rate was 1.23%. So you multiply this net number by 1.0123. This number cannot go any higher by law than 1.02 or 2%. That's where it gets the moniker 2% tax cap. However, here's the problem. Inflation right now is running at 3.5 or so. Now it may change by the time they do the calculation, but you're going to be limited to 2. But even so, 2 is a bigger number than 1.23. So you're going to end up with a bigger number down here. Then you subtract the pilots for the new school year. And if you'll notice in this case, notice what's happened here. The pilot is actually increased, right? But you're going to subtract it. So when the pilot increases, it lowers your tax cap. When the pilot decreases, it increases your tax cap. So pilots become problematic. Now, there is available carryover based on a formula, but considering most people want to keep their tax cap as low as possible, hardly anybody ever. I actually do not know of a single district that has carried over any money successfully in the last couple of years. I've seen it every now and then, but not in the last couple of years. And so you get this number before adjustments, and then you add your capital levy. In other words, when you do a capital project, if you notice in your resolution, it might say something like this. XYZ school district going to do a $10 million capital project and use $2 million capital reserve and therefore borrow $8 million. And then it says, and levy the tax thereto. And this is what the tax cap is supposed to do. It's supposed to enable you to collect the money for all your capital expenditures, whether it's buses, equipment, BOCES, whatever. And that's why it's added. So in this case, this district now, its levy limit is $10,249,001, or its tax cap is 2.49%. In English, it can collect $249.01 more legally with a 50% majority plus one person over the 10 million they collected last year. So this is how a tax cap works. It is not a 2% tax cap. If it comes out 2%, it came out by accident or by luck. Okay. Now, here's the dilemma. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of work on this tax cap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start freezing some things up here and getting some things ready. So now what we've got is I'm going to go to the 22-23 year. Okay. And I'm going to move some numbers around. So now I'm going to collect the 249. They do collect the 2.49%. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of keep this going. And there's the pilot. There's the 182. See how it goes up over here. Here's the capital levy of the 516, 650 from over here. See that? But I'm going to freeze the pilot. So I'm going to make it so nothing moves. I'm going to freeze the inflation rate. I'm going to freeze the growth factor. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take wherever you left off. Remember, that's where you start the next year. So that's what you collected in levy. And behold, when everything got frozen, look at next year, 1.6. So these things tend to vacillate, all things being equal. So it seems like you shouldn't have too many problems because I've kept the major items all in check. So that's really how it would work on paper. But here's what could happen otherwise. If we go along 21, 22, 22, 23, all the way to 25, 26, and I freeze all the numbers, except I simply let the tax cap run, notice how it stabilizes. See that? It actually stabilizes. So that's the thing. But you know what? Sometimes you get at one of those meetings and somebody says, what the heck? I mean, really? Look, it's 2.49. Why don't we just make it 1.99? It's a lousy 0.5% for God's sakes. Let's give everybody a break. What's the harm? Well, let's take a look at it. So here, over here on this side of the program, I've got the actual tax cap that we just did right there, collecting 249.01, 2.489. All of a sudden, somebody gets a bright idea. Let's make it 1.99. It's only 0.5%. Well, that means you can collect 199,000. You will not collect $50,001 that you could have collected. So now what's going to happen is people say, look, they forget to look at this number. How much are we not collecting? In other words, are you saying to me that we're doing so well, we don't need the $50,000 we're entitled to collect? Because see this bill right here? See this 516? The district still has to pay it. So if you don't collect the money to pay it, then what's going to happen here is you're going to pay it out of your fund balance or your reserves, because there is the dilemma. So now you're left what they call $50,000 on the table. What's the harm, someone would say? We can survive this 1 year. It's no big deal. Well, here's the problem. The problem is you no longer use the 10,249 to calculate your new tax cap the next year. You got to use the depressed number. So now you lowered the levy that's going to be used against all these numbers. And now if you're going to actually be $823 short that year. So you say, well, it's only $823,000. What's the big deal? Well, here's if we left everything alone. 249, 164, 167, 169, 172. 2.49, 1.6, 16, 16, 16. The new levy here, 10,923,000. Here's if you drop it 1%, 0.5%, 1 year only. You lost the 50,000, but guess what? You lose the 50,000 every year because you can't collect it. Because you failed to collect it this year, you can't collect it any of these other years because it's not in your calculation. Remember, you didn't use this number up here. You used this number, 50,000 less. So you lost 50,001. This year you lost 823 because you lowered the number plus the 50,000. So now that year you lost 50,000 to 824. The next year you lost another 836 plus the 50,000 plus the 823. So now that year you lost 51,660. And it keeps going every year until all of a sudden you add it up cumulatively and your total loss is $258,000. But it's worse than that. Your levy is now $53,000 lower than it could have been. So your district, by taking 0.5% off in this first year, just 0.5%, you could have had $311,000 in your 25-26. And I don't know of a district that doesn't need $311,000. So this becomes a real problem. So the tax cap is there for a purpose so we don't overtax people, but it's not there to grant tax relief because everything in it has to be paid for. Now, I wrote an example of this inflation business. I'm a little worried about this because next year, I think this number is going to go from here to here. And if you'll notice, remember how we were going to go to the 1.6? Remember I showed you if we kept on Make Pilot? Look at this. In this example, freezing everything for them because of this 2% sends them over 2% again. So they never get to the 1.6. because inflation is a big factor in this. So now they're up 2.3. If they dropped it down, look at this. They're back at 2.3. So they did everybody a favor, but they're out 50,000. Now they're out another 1,200. So actually it just makes things worse. Inflation is the problem you're going to have. Now, if you do the inflation and inflation goes over it and you lose the pilot, look, if we move the pilot, if I lose your pilot, it starts getting paid off and the pilot goes down, it too, instead of a 2.35, it's going to be here a 2.53. Because when the pilot goes down, it makes the tax cap go up. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. That's because the people paying the pilot are now on the tax rolls. And the only way you can get the money from the tax rolls is to increase the taxes. So it's actually possible that you could have, we'll say, let's make it up, a 2.5 increase in your tax levy, but everybody's taxes only go up, I'm going to make this up now, like 2.1, because the tax base was increased because the people paying the pilot are now in the tax rolls and not paying the pilot. So the only way you can actually get the money that the pilot used to pay is get it out of the tax rolls where it now resides. So this stuff tends to be very complicated. I think a lot of people really, this is a nice lesson for a board or a community or something that people should be aware of, because these things can come back and bite you, the tax cap. So here's my concerns. State funding cliff. I think the state's expenses for foundation aid coupled with the growth of expense-driven aids creates a significant escalation in state costs. The state's significant escalation costs are rapid and exist until at least 23-24. But what happens in 24-25 beyond the state's ability to continue this because it has actually federal support? In the same time periods as above, it is quite likely that school districts' fixed and contractual obligation costs will also have escalated. For instance, I was looking at a district today doing long-range plan, and they've got like a increase for their teachers at 3, 3.2, 3.2, 3.2, 3.2, and it comes out to 13.7. Guy says doesn't add up to that. That's right, because it's compounding. You compound these things. Compounding costs. In the same time period, there are likely to be increases in expectations of communities. So if you start supplementing a lot in your budget and all of a sudden there's services that were never there before, a lot of people are going to want you to create, provide, and maintain these additional services. So you got to be careful there about setting high expectations that you may not be able to meet economically. And then what will be the size of the difference between school district costs coupled with the community expectations to continue support on an escalating level? In other words, schools are going to continue to be more expensive. And are there similar ramifications related to federal funds? I think so, because what's actually happening is the federal funds will be gone in 3 to 4 years. And then the existence of the tax cap fits into this. So as long as you're long-range planning, you're going to be battling inflation, changing pilot agreements, and changing capital exclusions the whole time. Now, what would I do? Further guidance is needed in what can and can't be done with the federal funds, particularly capital projects, as I pointed out. To what degree is the district supplanting and versus supplementing? I think you really got to spend some time talking about that. And I think this is a great chance where you can actually use federal funds to allow for reallocations of the general fund monies and actually start building fund balances. As a practical matter, I must tell you, with the presence of increased state aid, should a school district plan to tax under the cap? I would say no, tax at your cap. Is there a downside if you tax under the cap? I think I just demonstrated to you, it can be very severe. With all the funds coming to school districts, will there be a need to increase taxes at all in the near term, and particularly if outside funds are exhausted? The problem you're going to have, I think, is maybe a PR problem where it looks like you're going to be flush with cash and you're still increasing taxes, but you got to live the fight another day. The truth of it is the taxes you collect every year are not necessarily for that year. They also help you build fund balance and to live subsequent years thereafter, maybe when the going gets tough. And what investments of federal funds will also save money in the long term and allow school districts to maintain healthy fiscal condition after the funds are expired? I'm telling you right now, it's the use of reserves, in particular capital reserves. And what is the process and timing of the receipt of federal funds, and how that should be, will they be audited? So the big problem, I think, is we're going to have a lot of record keeping, and it's going to be an arduous task. So let me stop my presentation right now and field any questions. I know there's been a lot of material here, and this stuff is very complicated, so I don't expect you to absorb it instantly. But school district finance is complicated, but I'll tell you, the penalty for screwing it up is brutal, as you all know. Yeah, I used to always say, look, I can screw up a lot as superintendent, but man, I can't screw up the money.
Yeah.
So are there any questions or comments that I can answer? Jim, like I said, after I hang up, I'll put everybody's data on and I'll send it to you as an update so that, because it just turned out to be too small. You couldn't read it on the screen.
Yeah, Rick, that'd be great. Thanks so much. Hey, yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of decisions that will have to be made in the next year as far as, you know, how to use it and to make sure they don't get in trouble with it.
Right.
And your point on the tax cap is great, Rick, because again, you know, on paper, everybody looks flush right now.
Right. Well, I think the thing is that I think most people always want to give taxpayers a break. I think it's natural to do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that when you can, but the truth of it is if you overdo it, it can easily turn out to be too much and you're never going to get that back.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine after that example I give you, all of a sudden turn around and say, everybody, look, we got to have like a 15-20% increase so I get my $300,000 back because I need it now. Because now we're out of federal money and now the state's having trouble. So can I get my money back? Can we have a 20% increase? That'll be my last day as superintendent, be my last day as business official. The board would turn over quickly.
Yeah.
You know, there'd be riot in the streets.
We know how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not good.
Right. Any
Any other
comments or questions?
From anybody in the group? Rick, as always, phenomenal job. The data is.
Oh, I think Bob's got one.
Yeah, I had a question that you would probably know better than anyone, Rick. They're looking at allegedly updating the foundation aid over 3 years.
Right.
And you've talked before about at least using numbers from perhaps this decade would be handy.
Yes.
And we've talked with even some local people, local legislators, and they're not quite sure where these new numbers for the formula or a new formula is coming from. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I can right now, actually. Well, first of all, one of the big ones that was a real problem was the 2000 census. If you remember that one, that was the one we always used to point out. It's like, give me a break. It's not even it's 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
But they did use in a supplemental, what they did is they ran the formula and they found out they didn't like the distribution of the funds. So what they did, don't you love it? So what they did is they created a series of supplemental formulas at the tail end of the formula. And lucky for us, 2 of our recommendations were accepted by them. One is they use what's called SAPE, the Small Area and Income Poverty Estimate, which is only 3 years in arrears. In other words, it's like the census, but it's not the full census, but it's a community-based poverty measure from the feds, and they use that in the new formula. So I'm hopeful they will switch those out over time.
Well, I don't even think they can use the newest census because they stopped it partway through because of COVID.
Yeah, I think they're not going to be able to use it. It's called the Small Area and Income Poverty Estimate. Its initials are SAPE, Small Area Income Poverty, and it's feds updated every year. But it usually, because it has to be audited, it's usually 2 to 3 years old only. So it's not a regular census. What they do is they get, the information from social services, they get information from real property tax service. So there's other ways they get this information. So they came up with this new metric. So they're using that as a supplement to the census itself, because the census, I think, is going to be a wash. Second thing they did do, it's a move in the right direction, but it's not enough. And that is, there's something called the Regional Cost Index, the RCI, in the formula that actually, in other words, we're in the Mohawk Valley. So no matter what they change in that thing, it's never going to help us, because our labor market is the lowest paid labor market, because it's a labor issue. It's a labor construct. And so what happens is we are always a 1 in that formula. And when you run that, and it's a multiplier too, that's what I hate. It's a multiplier. So when you multiply any number times 1, you get the same stupid number. Meanwhile, Long Island is like a 1.4, so I mean, they're getting this huge bump. But at least the rest of the state would be helped if that was more. I think what they got to do is break that up into smaller regions. I was talking to a guy from Finger Lakes, the Finger Lakes region this morning. And he lives in a poor part of the Finger Lakes region, so he doesn't get the bump he really needs with his labor market compared to what they would get, we'll say, in Canandaigua. Like he lives in Seneca Falls compared to Canandaigua. So they really got to bust that up, so there could be improvements there. Now, the biggest improvement, I think, especially would help all of you, would be what they call the foundation aid amount, the FA. It's known as the FA. Think of it this way. The foundation aid formula, first and foremost, is based on how many kids you have.
Right.
Right off the bat. It's kind of like, how many kids you got? And then what they do is they count the kids different ways. How many kids show up for attendance? How many kids are enrolled versus how many kids are disabled? How many kids are ELL? How many kids are living in poverty? But they first count the kids. They take that number and they multiply it times this number known as the foundation amount. Up until the last 3 or 4 years, that number was escalating beyond the rate of inflation. But the last few years, they only moved it at the rate of inflation. But the problem is inflation has nothing to do with our business because washers and dryers go up 1.2%. Textbooks are going up 10. Buses are going up 5. I mean, you used to be able to buy a bus $100,000. I'm buying them now for my clients at $135,000 a pop. So what happens is that foundation aid amount is not keeping up with the true cost of education. Now, if you're losing kids, think of it this way. So let's just say I'm paying you $1 a kid this year. Then you lose 10 kids and I'm paying you $1 a kid. Is it enough to make up for the kids you lost? And the answer is usually no. So what has to happen is the amount that they pay for a kid has got to go up substantially. Right now, it's like, I don't know, $6,800. It doesn't cost $6,800 to educate a kid. Give me a break. Get real. This thing should be like $8,000, $9,000. The dilemma will be how would the state pay for it if they have to do this universally? I think that's the only way to save you in terms of your foundation aid if your school district is losing kids. Because I think that's what's actually happening. Our enrollments, by and large, are diminishing rapidly.
Right.
So what happens, the first part of the formula is how many kids you got compared to last year. If you got less, automatically you got a problem. So, but if you can increase the pay per kid, maybe we can get past that. And of course, there's other parts in terms of weighting within the formula. I would be glad to meet with you at any time, you guys, before you meet with your legislators, or even meet with you when you meet with your legislators, if you wish, and go over any and all of these parts of the formulas and give examples.
Rick, that'd be great. Thank you so much. We'll take you up on that.
Yeah, I know Mary Ann Buttonshaw, you know, her new chief of staff, I know a lot. You know, I've worked with Joe Griffo like forever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know your legislators, at least in where I live, but I'd be glad to meet all of them or any of them if you hold a workshop or something.
Yeah.
And I can even do a presentation for you if you wish.
We've done we've made some great inroads, but same thing, Rick, your knowledge is just priceless. You know, that.
Yeah, and if you want to like meet with them and you want me to like prep you, that's fine too. Whatever's good for you is good for me.
Yeah.
In other words, I will help you any way that you want.
I think we had a question from Megan. Megan,
Sure,
you did
Megan.
chat, Megan?
Yes, I did submit a chat. The question is, Dr. Timms, thank you. This is Megan Burdick from Clinton Central School Board. My question is, I'm a little bit looking for some clarification on the timing of how districts will apply for the funds. So these FS 10F forms, would they be sort of submitting forms multiple times over the next couple years as they identify what they will spend the money on? Or is the idea that they would know in advance everything that they would hope to use the money for, and they would submit one form?
Okay, it's a little of both, actually, Megan. What's going to happen is they'll submit a full grant, and then it would be an FS10. The FS10F is when the grant's over. And then what they would do is they could amend the grant as they go. In other words, what the state really wants them to do is send in a couple applications to fill up the grant, to use up all the money in the grant. And then over time, amend your application as you get more clarity on what you want to use it on, because they know this is kind of a rush job, if that makes any sense to you. Does that make sense? Okay.
That does make sense. That it makes a lot of
so
sense.
I think you'll have some wiggle room in there as things develop over the years. Absolutely.
Okay, and then you referenced a date of September 30th.
Well, there's different dates due for different parts of each grant. I would probably, you could probably ask Joe, your business official, or your superintendent to get you these dates when they're due. My presentation was getting so cluttered with dates and this and that. I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to kill these people. But each one has a little different date. So I think those are the ones you'd probably want to, I'm sure Joe Beretta, your business official, by the way, you're one of my clients. He knows all about this. He would be glad, I'm sure, to fill you in.
Great. Thanks so much. Great presentation.
Thank you very much. Glad you were here. I think there were some more questions perhaps, or no?
Anybody else? All you have to do is turn off your mute. Well,
Now what I'll do is for the districts in Herkimer and Madison County, because I ended up with so many slides here and I thought I'm going to go over my time. I will provide a document to Jim Van Wormer. He can send out that will have all your districts in all 3 counties on them. Okay.
Rick, you're amazing. Thanks again. Appreciate it so much.
Right.
How about a little for Dr. Tim?
Holy cow.
And now
Time to bring out the popcorn. Holy mackerel.
Now you can go back with the grandkids and try to get back in their graces, Rick.
Tom's got popcorn. Jeez.
Be right over.
Oh
Hey,
my God.
thanks so much.
Can you
Now
add
listen,
Richfield into that?
If you do
We're
have a question,
Otsego County, but put Richfield in there.
no, I'll get both BOCES is what I meant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get all the BOCES. So I'll take care of everybody. Believe me, nobody's going to be left out. I'll actually do the entire globe. I'll have the globe. I'll have the entire globe in there. Don't look up Rwanda's though, whatever you do. So that's it. But if you have questions later, just get them to Jim and I'll be glad to field them anytime you want, right? Remember, this is what we're here for. We're all in this together.
You got it, Rick. Thanks again. And
Thank you
thanks
very much,
everybody
Rick.
for your time. We appreciate it very much. Bye, Rick.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Mr. Batson, you have a minute? Can you hold on?
Yep.
Tom Moats? Charlie, thank you.